welcome to International Business Transactions. This is Module 4, Lecture 5, the Sale Against Documents Transaction. If you've already gone through Lecture 4 of this module, this should be a fairly quick and easy lecture for you. The sale against documents transaction is nearly identical to the sale against documents with a confirmed letter of credit, except there's no confirmed letter of credit. There's no letter of credit at all. It's just a sale against documents. In this lecture, then, I'm going to go over the Incoterms that are associated with both of these transactions, and then walk you through the structure of the sale against documents transaction. I've already mentioned the risks facing sellers and buyers in transnational sale of goods transactions, but it's worth covering it again. If you understand these, you'll understand a lot of the different issues going on in the legal infrastructure surrounding such sales. The biggest risk for the seller is that it will ship goods to a remote buyer who's then going to say, hey, I've got your goods and I'm not paying you. Buyers don't want to pay in advance because then the seller's going to do the same thing. Hey, I've got your money and I'm not paying you. I'm not shipping the goods. The buyers have no protections against non-delivery and little leverage against the seller. A sale against documents transaction favors the seller's interests somewhat because it avoids the problem of a buyer taking possession of the goods before the buyer makes payment. Even if the buyer refuses to accept delivery of the goods, the seller is still in a better position. Yeah, the seller is stuck with a bunch of goods that are off in a foreign location and has to arrange for either remote resale of the goods or return of the goods. And the seller may also sue the buyer for damages if the buyer's refusal to accept delivery was a breach of the contract. But the seller would likely prefer this outcome to a situation in which the buyer has possession of the goods and refuses to pay altogether. A sale against documents transaction provides the buyer some minimal protection in the deal as well. The buyer's biggest loss in a sale against documents is the right to examine the goods before acceptance of delivery. The goods may have been non-conforming when shipped by the seller, or the goods may have suffered a casualty during the shipment. It doesn't matter. In the sale against documents or the sale against documents with a confirmed letter of credit transactions, the buyer is able only to examine the documents and can compare the description of what was supposed to be shipped through these documents to what it actually got. Well, to what the contract actually required. Theoretically, if there's any fouling on the bill of lading showing damage to the goods or to the packaging, the buyer may, on notice of the possible damage, be able to respond to it, to demand that the seller fix the problem. But the thing is, even if the buyer has notice of the fouling, in order to take delivery, the buyer must actually execute a second draft in favor of the seller and receive the bill of sale endorsed over to the buyer. Interestingly, this is an area where the Internet of Things can substantially increase the party's ability to allocate risks and responsibilities for losses that occur during shipment. As, for example, RFID devices, those little antennas that you find taped onto goods in your electronics store or whatever, as those devices and other sensors become ever cheaper and ever more interconnected, it's now possible for buyers and sellers theoretically to monitor every aspect of their supply chains. If a moisture sensor in a shipload of corn can notify the parties when the moisture level or the temperature level exceeds or drops below a certain threshold, the parties have a better chance of identifying without litigation or arbitration who's responsible for that loss. In looking at a sale against documents transaction, the seller and the buyer must contractually agree to structure their transaction as a sale against documents. Some Incoterms only actually work with a sale against documents transaction. Now note, I've posted a link on the D2L site to a website containing a good description and brief definitions of the 11 Incoterms. We covered them in Module 3, but I want to focus on two this time. The first of these is Cost, Insurance, and Freight, CIF. CIF requires the seller to arrange and pay for shipment and insurance on the goods to a named port, and to deliver the goods on board the ship arranged by the seller. Risk of loss passes to the buyer when the seller places the goods on board the ship. This means that any damage or casualty to the goods after the goods are placed on board the ship is the responsibility of the buyer, or really of the insurance that the seller bought on behalf of the buyer under the seller's obligations pursuant to the CIF Incoterm. The CIF obligation, paragraph A8, describes the document that must be used to ship the goods under this Incoterm. And this is why this is necessary and suited for a sale against documents or a sale against documents with a confirmed letter of credit. This document must first cover the contract goods. It means it has to fully describe them and fully encapsulate and fully afford an opportunity for the document to be compared to what was actually shipped and required by the contract. It must, second, enable the buyer to claim the goods from the carrier at the port of destination. And third, unless the parties agree otherwise, the document must enable the buyer to sell the goods in transit by the transfer of the document to a subsequent buyer or by notification to the carrier. This last requirement, this third requirement, can only be accomplished through a negotiable bill of lading. Only a negotiable bill of lading sufficiently represents the legal property interests in the goods to enable the buyer to sell the goods in transit by transferring the document to a subsequent buyer. The second Incoterm that actually works with the sale against documents transaction is cost and freight. So it's cost, insurance, freight, but without the insurance part. The CFT Incoterm. This term likewise requires or works with payment against documents under the same requirement that the transport document has to enable the buyer to sell the goods in transit by the transfer of the document to a subsequent buyer or by notification to the carrier. In a sale against documents transaction, regardless of whether there's a letter of credit or not, the seller gets this bill of lading, the document of title, from the carrier. And that document of title makes its way to the buyer long before the goods have gone across the ocean or made their way overland to the buyer's destination. So the buyer is sitting on this document for goods, and it's paid for those goods. It owns those goods. It means that the buyer doesn't even have to let the ship come to port to unload in its port. The buyer can just simply say, I'm going to sell this document to some third party and direct that the goods be reshipped over to that third party. And as a consequence, that's one of the utilities of the document of title. All right, so now I'm going to walk through the process of a sale against documents transaction. Setting this up, we have first the seller, and then next the buyer. Both of these parties are going to have banks. We've got the seller's bank, and we have the buyer's bank. The seller and the buyer make a contract to sell some goods, and we're going to call it these goods. This is going to be a shipment of gears, and we're going to sell it for $1 million. Everyone's happy. There's applause, hurrahs, huzzahs, but the problem is, how do the parties get the goods and how do they make payment? So we need to add a couple things. First, we're going to add a carrier. The seller contracts with the carrier and hands over the goods to the carrier. At the same time, the carrier prepares and delivers a bill of lading representing the contract, the bailment, and the legal right to ownership of the goods. The seller at this point, it's got the bill of lading that is actually made out to seller or to order, And with that bill of lading that describes the goods, it needs to prepare a sight draft to start the process for seeking payment. Now the goods are with the carrier. They're chugging away across oceans and rails and rivers and lakes and so on. The seller's going to take this bill of lading and it's going to take the sight draft to the seller's bank. The seller's bank will send the bill of lading and the sight draft to the buyer's bank. Now notice this is the difference between where we have a confirmed letter of credit and where we have just a plain old sale or payment against documents. Seller still doesn't get paid yet because all the seller's done is send off a bill of lading and a form of check, a sight draft. And that's got to make its way all the way through the system, and then the money has to make its way in the opposite direction. So the seller's bank is going to send these things off to the buyer's bank. And then the buyer's bank notifies the buyer that the bill of lading has arrived, and the buyer examines the bill of lading. Upon satisfaction, the buyer transfers money to the bank. Now notice again, the buyer doesn't get to inspect the goods. It only gets to inspect the document. The buyer looks at the document and the document says, wow, there's the number of gears, the amount of gears that I bought, they were loaded on a ship as represented by this bill of lading. So that's what you get to inspect. You don't get to inspect the goods in the underlying transaction. All right, so upon satisfaction, the buyer transfers money. They're inspecting the bill of lading. They transfer the money to the buyer's bank, and that bank transfers the bill of lading and the sight draft over to the buyer. Now, we're almost done. Buyer doesn't care about the sight draft. It's just the equivalent of getting a voided check. The buyer's bank transfers the payment back through the seller's bank to the seller or to the seller's account at the seller's bank. That's probably easier than getting a big bag of money. But here we go with the money, and it goes all the way to the seller or to the seller's account at the seller's bank. At this point, the buyer transfers the bill of lading to the carrier, and the carrier transfers the goods over to the buyer. Now there's applause. Now everyone is happy. Now we're done with this transaction, and with the completion of our successful sale against documents transaction, that also completes this lecture. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.